All right, here's your last question. What was the cause of the Civil War? Actually, there were numerous causes. Aside from the obvious schism between abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, economic factors, both domestic and international, played a significant... Yeah, just say slavery. Slavery it is, sir.
This is your House Divided Underlying Causes of the Civil War lecture. The objective for this lecture is for you to understand the political, economic, and social causes of the Civil War. The central cause of the Civil War was slavery, the politics, economics, and social effects of slavery. I showed you a clip from the Simpsons cartoon to drive home that point. Just say slavery. Before we talk about the underlying causes of the Civil War, let's first talk about the common misconceptions about the Civil War. The first misconception is that morality governed the debates about slavery. The morality of slavery was not a central issue. The Civil War was not fought over the moral issues of slavery. Beginning in the 1840s, debates about slavery were centered around political and economic gain. The issue was equality for the white men. The South wanted to continue the expansion of slavery, and geographic expansion of America was essential to that. The North was opposed to the expansion of slavery. And the introduction of new states would fuel this debate over slavery. The second misconception was that the South was responsible for the Civil War. That was not true. Both the North and the South misinterpreted each other's motives. And both the North and the South failed to settle grievances with each other over the issue of slavery. The third misconception was that Lincoln was a radical abolitionist. In fact, he was called the Great Emancipator because he eventually emancipated the slaves. But Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery in New Western Territory. And he believed the Constitution as it was. Lincoln didn't advocate bloodshed or violence to end slavery. The fourth conception was that each region, meaning the North and the South, was completely united in defiance of the other's actions. Meaning, not everybody in the North, a number of people who wanted to get rid of slavery completely. Those were the abolitionists. But others in the North just wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery, but not necessarily get rid of slavery completely. In the South, from another lecture, we talked about how the relationship in the South really was dependent on this idea of white superiority. That what poor whites and wealthy whites had in common was their view of white superiority. Because the poor whites were not really benefiting from slavery. In fact, a good majority of poor whites in the South didn't own slaves. And another example from the South is that the elite whites implemented a tax system on the poor. They had what was referred to as the Negro Law, that a white man who owned 20 slaves could be exempt from paying taxes. So if you had less than 20 slaves, then you had to pay taxes. In fact, poor whites had more in common with slaves than they did with wealthy whites, which were generally those who owned large plantations with a large amount of slaves. Because The poor whites were agricultural workers, and so were the slaves. And of course, the main distinction here is that one group of agricultural workers were slaves, and one group was not. And the fifth misconception was that slavery was not the central issue that caused the Civil War, but in fact, it was. And now, the underlying causes of the Civil War. As I mentioned, slavery was the central cause of the Civil War, but there were also underlying causes, such as westward expansion. This is an illustration of manifest destiny, and we've discussed manifest destiny before. Manifest destiny was the idea that America had a God-given or divine right to expand westward. It was the justification of American expansion in general. During the 1800s, there was an expansionist spirit among American settlers. In the 1840s, a major part of American politics was slavery because of territorial expansion. Part of that territorial expansion included the Mexican frontier. This area in the green is all land that used to belong to Mexico. But prior to belonging to Mexico, it belonged to Spain. But Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821. The first part of the Mexican frontier that America gained was Texas. It's referred to as the Texas Revolt. In Texas, there was a non-Indian population, and it was about 2000 when Mexico became independent, and those people were called Tejanos, but they were of Spanish origin. But in 1820, a gentleman by the name of Moses Austin, who was a Connecticut-born farmer, had an agreement with the Mexican government to colonize Texas. And Austin received a land grant from Mexico for Texas. After Moses Austin's death, his son Stephen took over and resold small plots of land to American settlers for about 12 cents an acre. But the Mexican government was concerned that its hold on the Texas land was weakening. And in 1830, it annulled the existing land grant or contract and barred future immigration into Texas from the United States. But Stephen Austin, along with the American settlers in Texas, demanded greater autonomy within Mexico. And they were joined by the elite Tejanos. And the Tejanos were generally ranchers and farmers in Texas. Mexico had also abolished slavery. But American settlers had been allowed to bring slaves with them into Texas, which upset Mexico. So in 1835, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sent an army to impose central authority. And in response to Santa Anna, the Texas rebels formed a provisional government that called for Texas independence. This led to what's referred to as the Alamo. At the Alamo, Santa Anna's group killed about 187 defenders, including Tejanos and American settlers. And Sam Houston, who was a former governor of Tennessee, defeated Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto. So what happens as a result is that Texas got its independence. And the Texas Congress, which was part of this provisional government and became part of a permanent government when Texas became independent, the Texas Congress called for a union with the United States in 1837. So in other words, they wanted Texas to be annexed into America. Both Presidents Jackson and Van Buren wouldn't do it because of political concerns of adding another slave state to the Union. And that was a hot political issue at the time, so they didn't want to get involved. By 1845, you're going to have about 150,000 settlers in Texas, including slaveholders. Another part of this westward expansion was the Mexican-American War. James Polk became president as a result of the election of 1844. In fact, he beat out Van Buren for the Democratic nomination and eventually won the presidency. Polk supported Texas annexation. He also supported the reoccupation of all Oregon territory. This was referred to as 54-40 or fight. And what that was is Britain still owned a small part of territory in the modern-day Oregon area. And so he wanted to make that territory part of the U.S. So he was very pro-westward expansion. So Polk's goals included settling the Oregon dispute. So he made an agreement with Great Britain dividing Oregon at the 49th parallel. He also wanted to bring California into the Union. In fact, Polk offered to purchase California from Mexico, but Mexico refused. So what Polk does is he initiates a war with Mexico to get California. So what happened is this. American soldiers moved to the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, which was land claimed by both America and Mexico. It was a disputed border. Fighting broke out there, and Polk claimed that Mexico had shed American blood. Therefore, America had to go to war with Mexico. A majority of Americans supported the war, but some were concerned that the only goal was to get new land for the expansion of slavery. People such as Henry David Thoreau and Abraham Lincoln. So the Mexican-American War was fought on three fronts. It was fought in California, it was fought in Santa Fe, and it was fought in central Mexico. The effects of the Mexican-American War include the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the effects of race as it relates to manifest destiny, and the view of Anglo-Saxon superiority. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848, and it ended the Mexican-American War. The treaty confirmed the annexation of Texas, and it ceded modern-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah to the United States. As for the effects of race, as it relates to manifest destiny, the Mexican territory that became part of the United States had been a region that had been united, but it was suddenly split into two after the war, and that divided families and severed trade routes. Male citizens were guaranteed American rights, and Indians were described as savage tribes. During the 1840s, territorial expansion was seen as proof of the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. Another underlying cause of civil war was the Northern view versus the Southern view regarding the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. The Northern view included the Free Soil Movement and the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Movement included the Wilmot Proviso, which was a resolution proposed by Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania. The proviso prohibited slavery from all territory acquired from Mexico. The Free Soil Party was a political party, and its platform included barring slavery from Western territories and having the federal government provide homesteads to settlers without cost. So basically, what the Northern view is that they wanted free labor in the Western territories and not slave labor. They felt that slave labor was hurting the American Republic's progress, that settlers need to move out west, they would work, and as a result of their work, they would be contributing to the economy. They felt that slavery was not contributing to the economy, that the only people that were benefiting from slavery were the southern plantation holders. So they felt that the federal government should give homesteads to American settlers to encourage them to move out west, which is what the American government did. They provided the Homestead Act, which allowed settlers to have 160 acres of land in exchange for improving on that land within 5 years. So if they improved on that land for 5 years, that would be their land. The Southern view felt that barring slavery from the new Western territories or the new Mexican territories was a violation of their equal rights. They felt that the admission of the Western territories as new free states would make the South a political minority, which it would have, because if the new Mexican territories came in as free states, then that gave the northern part of the country more political power. But if they came in as southern states, then that gave the South more political power. And the South needed that political power if they wanted to maintain their way of life, if they wanted to maintain slavery. Because if you have states that are coming in and they're coming in as free states, then they're going to side with the northern territories. And the fear was that they would eventually get rid of slavery as a result of that, because they would have the political power to do so. Another underlying cause of the Civil War was the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 relates to both westward expansion and the northern versus southern view regarding the expansion of slavery into the new western territories. The compromise included the admission of California as a free state. It also included the abolition of the the slave trade in the District of Columbia. It also included stronger fugitive slave law. It was called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act allowed special federal commissioners to determine the fate of alleged fugitive slaves without the benefits of a jury trial or even testimony by the accused individual. So basically, it allowed the Southerners to get runaway slaves back because the federal government hadn't been enforcing this issue with runaway slaves. In other words, if a slave ran away to the north, there was really no real enforcement of finding that slave and having them returned to the Southerners. But this really strengthened that enforcement. And the compromise also included that the new territories, excluding California, would determine their own slavery status. So, in other words, their own provisional government could determine whether that state was going to be a free state or whether it was going to have slavery. The Nebraska Act of 1854 is another underlying cause of the Civil War. This act relates to westward expansion and the differing views between the North and the South regarding the expansion of slavery in the new Western territories. Stephen Douglas, who was a Democratic senator from Illinois, introduced a bill to establish territorial governments for Nebraska and Kansas so that a transcontinental railroad could be constructed. This railroad was also going to be constructed in Illinois, which would benefit his state. So, what this act does is it undermines the Missouri Compromise, which had been passed earlier. If you remember, under the Missouri Compromise, there could be no slavery above the 3630 parallel. Well, the Kansas Territory falls above the 3630 parallel, where there was not supposed to be slavery. Well, this act changes all of that by making the status of the territory provisional, meaning the voters in this territory could decide whether the state could be free or slave. Of course, the Southerners wanted it to be slave because that would give them more political power, and the Northerners did not want it to be slave because it would give them less political power. So what ends up happening here is there's a lot of chaos over this issue of this territory being free or slave. There's fighting. They called it Bleeding Kansas. And it just furthers this debate over whether there's going to be slavery in the new Western territories or whether there's not going to be slavery in the new territories. This act caused a rift between the Northern and Southern Democrats because many of the Northern Democrats opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act also caused the collapse of the Whigs and the rise of the Republican Party. If you'll remember, the Whig Party believed that a strong federal government was needed to promote liberty and guide economic development. It also supported the America system, and it believed that government should promote morality to take care of the welfare of the people. The Republican Party included disgruntled Democrats, Northern Whigs, Free Soilers, and the Know-Nothings. The Know-Nothings were a party that appealed to anti-immigrants and anti-slavery. And they were called the Know-Nothings because they were a secretive party, and you couldn't talk about the goings-on of the Know-Nothing Party. Republican Party adopted the economic view of the Northerners. They believed in free labor. They were anti-slavery, and they were against the expansion of slavery. They were not abolitionists as a whole, but they were against the expansion of slavery. And they pointed to Bleeding Kansas as helping the Republican Party. Remember, that was Douglas's policy. And Bleeding Kansas created all this chaos in the Kansas-Nebraska territory. So they said, look, you can't expand slavery because this is the type of chaos that it causes. So we should just not have the expansion of slavery at all. We shouldn't allow the voters to make the decision one way or the other. We should just not have the expansion of slavery. So what we have with respect to political parties is we have the Democratic Party, which came about as a result of the 1824 election. We had the collapse of the Whig Party. Now we have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So we have a two-party system. Dred Scott versus Sandford was a Supreme Court case that was an underlying cause of the Civil War. Dred Scott was a slave who moved with his master to a free territory. So in Dred Scott's view, since he lived in a free territory, didn't that make him free? So he sued in the courts for his freedom. But Dred Scott didn't obtain his freedom. The courts did not decide in Dred Scott's favor. In fact, the court declared that only white persons could be citizens of the United States, and it declared that Congress had no power under the Constitution to bar slavery from a territory. In their view, the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional. The importance of this case is that it states that white persons could be citizens. No one else could be citizens. So it establishes a precedent for that. It also creates a lot of chaos with respect to these new territories, because now it says that Congress can't decide whether these territories are free or slave. So it creates a lot of confusion. And it fuels the debate over whether this new territory is going to be slave or whether it's going to be free. The Lincoln-Douglas debates was an underlying cause of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was a moderate Republican, and he ran against Senator Stephen Douglas, who was a Democrat. So Lincoln was running for Douglas's Senate seat. And it's during these debates that we learn about each of their views of freedom. Lincoln said that freedom meant opposition to slavery. He didn't mean the abolition of slavery, just that slavery should not expand. During these debates, he states the following: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe that government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." His point here is that civil war was not imminent, but Americans had to choose between being for or against slavery. Douglas believed that freedom was about local self-government and individual self-determination, that everyone should have the right to decide for themselves. In other words, popular sovereignty. Douglas believed that popular sovereignty was compatible with the Dred Scott decision, so he was in favor of the Dred Scott decision. He felt that if people didn't want slavery, then they would provide protections against having slavery. Douglas was reelected to his Senate seat. Politically, this election shows the division between northern and southern Illinois. And it really highlights the division between the expansion of slavery and not expanding slavery. This debate that was really heating up in the country. With respect to Lincoln's views on race, Lincoln opposed giving Illinois blacks the right to vote or serve on juries. Lincoln believed in the colonization of blacks, meaning he thought there would be a race war if slavery was abolished. He believed that blacks should go live on a different area of the world or off to themselves. But he did believe that blacks were entitled to inalienable rights. So it's kind of a slippery slope when it comes to Lincoln's view. And this is what I meant by Lincoln was not an abolitionist. There was a congressional incident that also contributed to the Civil War occurring. This was an incident between Senator Preston Brooks of South Carolina and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. What happened was Preston Brooks beat Senator Sumner with a cane, and he basically beat him unconscious. So this contributed to this view between the North and the South. In other words, Northerners said that the South was so adamant about keeping slavery that they would resort to violence by beating a Northern senator, someone who disagreed with them. So it just really widens the gap between the North and the South's view of each other, and really contributes to this heated debate that was going on at the time. The Harper's Ferry incident also is an underlying cause of the Civil War. What happened was abolitionist John Brown led an armed assault on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And this heightened tensions between those who wanted to expand slavery and those who did not. Basically, it heightened the debates between the North and the South. So what ended up happening is John Brown got caught. He was placed on trial for treason, and he was executed. And he pretty much turned into a martyr for the North. And it also contributed to the North's view of the South. So they said that the Southerners wanted to keep slavery so much that they would resort to executing an abolitionist, someone who was against slavery. So this incident also widens the gap between the North and the South. So tensions are really rising between the two. Ultimately, this tension between the North and South led to the rise of Southern nationalism. Southern states wanted to build a slave empire. So they were leaning towards seceding from the Union, because staying meant being under the North's thumb, and they were tired of that. Southerners wanted southward expansion, meaning the Caribbean, Cuba, and other West Indies islands, Mexico, and parts of Central America as well. They created what was called the Ostend Manifesto, which is where they wanted the U.S. to purchase Cuba because slavery was still legal there. In fact, the Southern leaders pushed for it. And in the end, the U.S. did not purchase Cuba. But the straw that really broke the camel's back and that led to the Southern states to secede from the Union was the presidential election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The Republican platform was that the Dred Scott decision was not valid. They also believed in protective tariffs. And they also believed in government aid for the Transcontinental Railroad. But what the Southerners were really worried about was that Lincoln's victory would jeopardize the Southern life. The Southerners were concerned that Republicans would appeal to non-slave holders in the South. Remember that the connection between the Southerners was this kinship and superiority over blacks. That the majority of the people in the South didn't own slaves and didn't benefit from slaves, but the plantation holders did. But they had this kinship of white superiority. So they were worried that the Republicans would appeal to these non-slave holders and make them realize that slavery was not in their best economic interest. So ultimately, the Southern states would start to secede from the Union. At first, it was 7 states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The others would secede later, and there would be a few that would remain neutral. And we'll talk about all of that in the Civil War lecture. And in conclusion, the causes or contributing factors of the Civil War are as follows: the Missouri Compromise, which was part of westward expansion. America purchased the Louisiana Territory. There was no mechanism in the Constitution to decide whether the territory would be free or slave. So the Missouri Compromise happened, where you couldn't have slavery above the 3630 parallel. There was also the Texas Revolt. America gains new territory because it annexes Texas into America. And so there is a concern over whether Texas is going to be free or slave. It ends up being slave, which adds to the political power of the southern slave states. There was the Mexican-American War, where America gained new territories such as California, Utah, New Mexico, etc. Again, the Constitution doesn't provide a mechanism for determining whether these new territories are going to be free or slave, so it contributes to this debate over what do we do with new territory. There was the North versus Southern view. The North's view was that America should progress with free labor. and get rid of slavery, whereas the South wanted to expand slavery. There was the Compromise of 1850, which also involved westward expansion, and it was bringing in of California as a free state, and then making provisions for where the other new territories would decide for themselves whether there be a free or slave state. This also contributes to that northern view versus southern view of the expansion of slavery. There was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which also involved westward expansion in the northern versus southern view. This is where the territory who had formerly had no slavery was changed to where their voters could decide whether their territory would be free or slave. There was the Dred Scott decision. It basically said that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that only white people could be citizens. Then there was Harper's Ferry, which deepened the gap between the Northern and Southerners' view of each other. The Southerners felt that the Northerners felt so strongly about getting rid of slavery that they would commit an act of treason, whereas the Northerners felt that this act was just an act of martyrdom. Lincoln's election concerned the Southerners because they felt the Southerners and the Republicans were going to convince the non-slave-holding whites that slavery was no longer needed. And then finally the congressional incident between Sumner and Brooks, and the Northerners felt that the Southerners were so strongly in favor of keeping slavery that they would hit someone else with a cane and be violent towards them. So that concludes this lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.